part of Earth Day, at least electronically, with all you Terps, and to say enormous thanks for what you're doing. I wish I was there in person, partly because I kind of like to be out of my house, and partly because you guys are at one of those, real centers of this fight. I remember being on campus at UMD like 15 years ago for the first of the big global power shift action to young people from around the country by their thousands there. And it was a remarkable night, and getting to address people in the basketball court just pumped up and ready to fight. And it was amazing. Since that time, the climate movement has grown by leaps and bounds, and campuses and students have been right at the forefront of it, which is why what you guys are doing is so important. Look, that's where we learned about climate change. That's where the science came from. Universities are where people began to figure out that there was a lot more than science that we needed to understand. We needed to understand economics and political science and psychology and sociology and theology and every other part of it. And also, campuses are where people started coming together to fight, to do the activism that's what's required to make change happen. One of the parts that I've been involved with, of course, has been the wonderful divestment fight that you guys have done so well on. And now we see that it's moving into this battle with some of the biggest financial institutions in the world, the Chase banks and the Black Rocks and things. We've formed this Stop the Money Pipeline Coalition. We're working with Climate Strike and Fridays for the Future and young people around the world, and old people, because old people tend to have more money than young people, if sometimes less sense. And so that's been powerful, and it's going to need to be powerful. We need to make sure that you guys let Chase Bank know you're never opening an account or taking out a credit card. We need that kind of pressure on them. Action, activism, pushing is what this is about. I wrote the first book on climate change. It came out 31 years ago now, 1989, which I'm painfully aware was long, long before you were born. And at the time, we were issuing warnings about what was going to happen if we didn't do enough. And we didn't do anywhere near enough. And so now we're issuing bulletins from the front line about what is happening, and none of it's good. You watched Australia burn in January, though that seems a long time ago. We watched, even as this pandemic spreads, we watched the Great Barrier Reef bleach again. So much of the largest living thing on Earth now dead. We're watching in Africa right now as the biggest plague of locusts in history spreads out across the continent, eating up people's crops even as they confined to their homes by coronavirus. It's a tough moment, and it's a foretaste of what a tough world we're going to live in if we don't get our act together. But it also reminds us that we can get our act together. It reminds us that we have to take science seriously. It reminds us that delay is fatal. These are very good messages to get out into the world. And if we're going to go through the pain and trauma we're going through, we might as well learn some lessons from it. And those, I think, are some of the important lessons. Anyway, you guys can do this. You know how to bring together faculty and staff and students. You know how to participate in discussions like these. And then you know how to go out and make stuff happen as a result. We don't have much time to deal with climate change. That's the unfortunate truth. We do have enormous leverage for the next 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 years, so we might as well use it. Might as well do everything we can while we can. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Well, many thanks. Oh my gosh.
Well,
many thanks to Bill McKibben for passing along that video. We're so grateful for him being able to be a part of the event, even as further remotely as he was. I love what he said. We need to do everything we can while we can. And now I'd like to hand it over to our wonderful panel moderator, our Student Government Association's Director of Sustainability, Candela Cerva.
Thank you, Maggie. And thank you all for joining us to celebrate the Earth Day's 50th anniversary. I am really thankful that we are able to still bring this celebration to you despite this current affairs that were going on. And I want to thank our amazing panelists for taking their time to share their knowledge and experiences on sustainability with us, as well as the incredible student leaders, staff members, and alumni who are going to be guiding the breakout rooms. So now to start us off, I would like each panelist to introduce themselves with a sentence or two about who you are and what you do. Delegate Stewart, would you like to start?
Okay, it helps to unmute yourself. That's a good lesson that we can all take. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Vaughn Stewart. I represent the central part of Montgomery County in the Maryland House of Delegates, and I'm really excited to be here on the panel this afternoon.
Emily, do you want to go next? Yeah.
Hi, my name is Emily Frias. I'm the grassroots coordinator at Chesapeake Climate Action Network, which is a small advocacy organization in Maryland, DC, and Virginia. And we fight really hard for legislative wins and progress on climate. I can't believe that Earth is already 50 years old today. It's a little joke I saw on Twitter today. But in all seriousness, this is a historic Earth Day, and I'm really grateful to be part of this panel.
Thank you. Dr. Heltman, would you like to go next?
Sure. Hi, everybody. And my name is Nate Holtman. I'm a professor in the School of Public Policy at the University of Maryland, and I also direct our Center for Global Sustainability. My work is primarily on understanding our opportunities for action on climate change, and in particular, how to both understand those opportunities, but also how to build processes that engage with the people in our communities and in our society so that we can collectively build higher ambition to deal with climate.
Yeah. And then lastly, but not least, Mr. Hoagland.
Sure. Great, I'm on. Afternoon, thanks for having me. I'm Chris Hoagland. I'm the program manager of the climate change program at Maryland's Department of the Environment. We're the pollution regulators. We manage a couple of greenhouse gas pollution control programs, and we also coordinate the statewide planning process to develop our climate change plans.
Thank you. And thank you all again for joining us today. So to start us off, given that we are celebrating 50 years of Earth Days, I would like to begin with a reflection on the past 50 years of the environmental movement in the state of Maryland. So if you all could share how you got into the environmental movement, what lessons you've learned from it, and in your time working within the environmental movement, how have you seen it change? It can be in any order.
This is Chris. I'll start. I haven't been around for that many of the 50 Earth Days yet, but I've been working in this field for the last, I don't know, 10 or so. I got involved through politics and government. I worked on, just out of college, I worked on some political campaigns in 2008, and that turned into a government job. Working on sustainability for federal agencies, and I've seen that, based on my experience, I've seen the focus within environmental work in government shift more and more toward climate change, as obviously the crisis has grown and the urgency has grown. And I've also seen, I think, within work on climate change, more recently in the last several years, more and more focus on the challenges of environmental justice and climate justice, as we've realized it's not just good enough to reduce pollution, we have to reduce it in an equitable way. And that's what I think one of the major challenges facing government responses to climate change, even in places where those responses are relatively mature, like Maryland, is how do we transition from just less CO2 to reducing CO2 in a way that really that benefits lots of different communities.
So I'll maybe build a little bit on that. There's a couple parts of that question. One is about us ourselves, and one is about the sort of arc of Earth Days. And again, I'm in the same boat as Chris. I haven't been around for all the Earth Days, but what I can do is maybe just paint a very briefly, sort of thinking about where we got, how we got here. Early Earth Days were focused, as probably many of you know, on kind of dealing with a lot of what we could call today local pollution issues. So clean water, clean air, toxics in the environment, these kinds of things, which remain critically important issues for the communities that Chris was just talking about, right? So those are really important core issues about sustainability and a healthy Earth. Over the course of the time, though, it's expanded the vision of what that means to include global problems like climate change, like ozone, and several others like biodiversity loss that go beyond local scales. And I think that's been an interesting evolution to the point where we now have both international and national, and even now increasingly local connections to those sort of global issues. And so if I were to say what the evolution was, it was kind of first in starting at local, evolving to global, and now we're actually trying to figure out how we deal with some of these global issues at a local level. And that's actually where we, in some ways, not that this is only around climate and Green New Deal, is connecting across all.
Thanks. To the previous two answers, I think they're both really informative. So first I want to answer how I got involved in climate work, because I think that a lot of people on this call could follow really similar paths. So I went to Baltimore Polytechnic Institute. Shout out if there's any Baltimore Polytechnic alumni on this call. And we actually had we had a video intercom system, and the science department head at Baltimore Polytechnic showed an inconvenient truth on the video intercom system, which was a really incredible move. Really got an entire school of students really aware of the issue. And when I saw that, my first thought was, oh my gosh, I live in Baltimore City. And I'd already experienced Hurricane Isabella when I was a kid. So I kind of had this background in my mind of like, oh my gosh, like I'm in an area where we could really see some serious impacts. I remember my neighbors kayaking up my street, like that could be my future again. And, not only that, the backdrop of Baltimore City, which is a city that has a long history of inequality, and there are parts of Baltimore that really have been affected that already look devastated, because they already are. So I kind of went into college with those questions in mind. I went to UMBC, and I studied economics and geography to get because it really is we have a lot of questions to answer about the policy, about the system change that we need to see. And so then I became I did a lot of student activism, and those experiences really taught me how to organize, how to connect with folks, and that really launched me into a lifelong commitment to activism and social justice. So after that, I worked in the Maryland legislature for a little while, which was really informative. I also recommend, if you can get that experience, to volunteer or try to be staff in the legislature in Minneapolis. It's really informative to see how that happens, and I'm sure Delegate Stewart will speak a little bit more to that. And that has really launched me into where I am today. I want to say that, so from the time that I've been aware of this issue, really thinking about it, I think the biggest thing that has changed that I've seen is the communication, is the way that we're talking about this is a much more people-focused issue. I think that for a long time, a significant part of the communications were about larger environmental aspects, polar bears come to mind, and that stuff is all very, very important. But when it comes to really how this is going to impact people's lives, I feel like that is where I'm seeing a lot of the growth in this movement, is really bringing it home as to why this is a justice issue, and why this is a people issue. That's ultimately what we're fighting for. So that for me has been the biggest change, even in recent years.
Okay, I think Delegate Stewart is having some trouble unmuting himself. Maggie, could you help?
There we go. Okay. So thank you. So I echo all those sentiments as well. So personally, I grew up in a small town in Alabama that's sort of in the foothills of the Appalachian mountain range. And Monsanto used my hometown as a dumping ground for PCBs. It was their major PCB production facility for decades. And they didn't tell the community and they didn't tell their workers that they knew that the PCBs were toxic to human health, and yet dump them in the waterways and put them in the air. And it's no coincidence that my hometown is, it's now a Superfund site. The cancer rates are far, many, many times the national average. And while I can't prove any causality, it's probably not a coincidence that I have actually had and beaten cancer twice, both before the age of 30. And most recently, I had non-Hodgkin lymphoma in 2017, and in all the studies, the cancer that's most closely affiliated or associated with PCB contamination is non-Hodgkin lymphoma. So I sort of came to the environmental movement in a really personal way, in a way that really impacted me and my community and my family, and really through kind of the aforementioned environmental justice movement. And so I went on to college and law school. I tried to get involved in my community as much as possible here in Montgomery County, joined a variety of, boards and organizations I could. And then I made the decision in 2018 to do the craziest possible thing one can do, which is to run for political office. And so here I am. In terms of the environmental movement in Maryland, or nationwide, the first thing to note, I think, is that things have gotten way worse since 1970. That's the sort of tragic truth, is that the problems that they envisioned in 1970 are on a scale that's far, far smaller than our problems here in 2020. Maryland, you can point to a number of milestones since 1970 on the sort of more positive side. We've taken really positive proactive steps on the Chesapeake Bay restoration, both in terms of stormwater pollution and agricultural runoff. We implemented a renewable portfolio standard much earlier than many states and have continued to strengthen it over the years. The opening of the DC Metro system in 1976 was a huge milestone. The opening of the MARC commuter rail system in 1984 was a big milestone. And then most recently, the decision to ban fracking in Maryland really put Maryland again as a national leader. So we do have some clear victories. I think that the environmental movement certainly has changed a lot in 50 years. I think one of the more notable points is that it's gotten a lot less bipartisan. Certainly, I'll give a hat tip to Governor Hogan with Chris here. He's been a really pleasant surprise in this regard. But I think most of the people in his political party across the country have gotten less and less interested in environmental activism and environmental sustainability since 1970, which I think is unfortunate. I think maybe on the more positive side, the environmental movement, as others have referenced, has gotten less white and less wealthy over time. I think at the start of 1970, it was really talking about a relatively small cadre of well-heeled coastal elites, if you will. And I think that especially with the advent of the conversation around the Green New Deal, there have been some really good steps forward in terms of centering frontline communities, centering workers, including displaced workers. And so if we had this conversation of the 50-year anniversary had been 2 years ago, I probably would have overall expressed much more pessimism about the way we were heading. But I think that with the youth, which I know we're going to talk about later, but the youth climate activisms and the youth climate strikes and all the progress that's even been made on the federal and the state level in the last couple of years, I think that for the first time in a while, I think I feel cautiously optimistic about where we're headed.
Great, thank you all so much. So with that in mind about how we have reflected on the past, I would like us to reflect on the future a bit and talk about how you view that we can build an effective environmental movement in Maryland, given the shortcomings and successes that we've had in the years past.
So I can start with a little bit. I think building a bit on a couple of Delegate Stewart's comments. I think one, we have some strengths in Maryland that we should take advantage of. One is that we've been acting on climate change in particular for a long time. We've had legal requirements for Maryland to reduce greenhouse gas emissions since 2009. We in addition to all those milestones the delegates mentioned, where we've been early leaders. So we have this. We have a history to build that we can build on here in Maryland. We have a strong legal and policy framework we can build on in Maryland. We also have, the conversation about climate change in Maryland is very different than it is in other states and nationally, right? Maryland is a place where, generally we just disagree about how quickly and how ambitiously and how exactly to act. There isn't disagreement about whether to act or whether there's an urgent need to. That's broadly accepted by everybody. So Maryland is a good place to have the conversation, a good place for us to show other states what really ambitious action can look like, because it's something that we all recognize that we need to take.
Thanks. I'll go next. So I think when it comes to what we need to do next, this issue just really needs to be part of much more people's everyday lives. I know that CCN and definitely the Sunrise Movement and Extinction Rebellion have all been inspired by the work of Harvard researcher Erica Chenoweth, who's become a bit of a popular figure. And her research really examined democratic reform movements for the last little over 100 years. And she found that after about 3.5% of the population is actively participating in that reform effort, that effort was guaranteed to succeed. So 3.5% might sound like a kind of relatively small number, but there's two things to keep in mind, which is that's measuring active participants, and that in the United States, that would be about 11 million people. And in Maryland, that would be a little over 200,000 people. So we really need to grow. We really need to grow big. And we need to grow consistent. So I think that we really need to focus on campaigns that involve reaching out to more people and reaching out to people in a meaningful way that really builds buy-in and really speaks to people's lived experiences. So I know that we're going to be embarking soon on sort of small group house-focused communication sessions, listening sessions, where we're going to be asking people really how this issue impacts them and how they'd like to see it solved, and then really challenge people to continue to get their friends and family involved, to continue to grow and to continue to stay really active. So that's the kind of movement building I think that we need to see, so that it really becomes part of so many more people's identity and everyday life to be thinking about this issue, just given the scale of action that we're going to need to see, because we really need like system-wide economic reform to get to the emissions reductions recommended by the IPCC. Which IPCC stands for Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It was a really big, famous 12-year, you might have heard the 12-year deadline to reduce emissions by at least 60% for wealthy nations by 2030. That's ambitious, it's huge. So we need a movement to match the scale of the problem.
So I think that's a great point. Let me, the question was, how do we build an effective environmental movement in Maryland? And that the previous two comments get to that. We in Maryland have a unique opportunity it is absolutely within our grasp to drive the most ambitious policies here in our state, and in doing so to inspire and contribute to a much higher ambition toward an environmental movement across the country. Let me illustrate this in two ways. So first, the work that we're doing here at the University of Maryland through my center and some others is part of the America's Pledge initiative. What this is it's a project that links with stakeholders not only in our state but across the country that are stepping up and committing, in my case, to climate action as one part of sustainability, but on climate particularly. There are nearly 4,000 actors across the country who have stepped up to do this. They are states, including ours. They are cities. They are businesses, communities of faith, tribal groups, counties, universities, and many other kinds of organizations who have all stepped up to say, we are still committing to climate change action, even in this kind of crazy world of the loss of federal leadership. What we've shown is that that coalition of actors can itself drive the US emissions trajectory down significantly from where it otherwise would have been. And with additional state action of the kind that we can lead here in Maryland, we can envision that states, cities, and businesses alone could drive US emissions down to something like 37% below 2005 level by 2030. That itself helps us get on a track of getting the world on a 2°C trajectory in our country of the United States, right? With federal engagement after the next election, we could, of course, do more. So the next election is clearly critical, but right now, even within our own state, we have the power to do much more on this topic. And I think this is my second point, which is where Chris's comment is extraordinarily important. Maryland has a culture of pragmatic, collaborative, science-driven leadership with broad political engagement. It is different from the rest of the country, right? But it allows us a platform to do much more in a much more politically grounded way that is robust to kind of comings and goings of different political stripes. I think that even the current administration in the governor's office, as Governor Vaughn mentioned earlier, is doing tremendous work already on climate here in our state already. And so we have this tremendous opportunity, and it is now up to us to sort of think about how we can organize ourselves in Maryland to do that next step. And that was, I think, what Emily's point was also on.
Yeah, so I think that they're all really good points. And I think just building off of that, I mean, I would say that we do really have a unique opportunity in Maryland to create some bipartisan change. And we have seen bipartisan results in Maryland in the past. However, I think we've also unfortunately seen a bipartisan lack of boldness from both parties and in both the governor's mansion and in the legislature. A lot of people are willing to hold hands and sing kumbaya and say that they believe in climate change, but when it comes to taking tough votes or taxing, wealthy campaign contributors or the like, or taking sort of the bold steps that actually meet the scale of the problem, I think in Maryland there have been way fewer people willing to do that, and I think that has to change. And so in order to push elected leaders to do the right thing here and to listen to the science and to act accordingly, it's about coalition building. Like Emily said, I mean, you have to build a broad enough coalition to actually make politicians give a damn. And I think that there is a blueprint for coalition building. We just have to look at states like New York with their dirty buildings bill, or even in Washington, where you recently had a housing densification bill pass alongside a rent stabilization bill. And I think both of those states show you that the formula here for building a broad enough coalition to actually enact a bold policy change is to bring in groups that aren't usually thought of as aligning with the environmental movement. If you craft the policies in a way that they appeal to more than just wealthy white people, if you craft them in a way they actually appeal to working families, they appeal to frontline communities, they appeal to communities of color, then you can build a coalition that's broad enough that that really makes a difference. And I think if we just craft policies, as Chris mentioned earlier, just focusing narrowly on decarbonization as rapidly as possible, and we're not giving equity sort of the full attention that we need, that's not only a problem just morally and in terms of policy making, it's also a huge political problem, because it's only by centering those communities and by putting economic inequality on the front burner of the conversation that we can build a coalition broad and deep and focused enough to actually win some of these victories that we so desperately need.
Great, thank you all. And thinking about how we can move forward and involve different groups, the first Earth Day was a teaching with the goal to educate others on the environmental problems that they were facing, as well as what solutions they could undertake. And we are hosting this from UMD. So we are kind of at the center of the academia in the state government, in the state of Maryland, but also youth activism. So if you all could talk a bit about how you have seen higher education, academia, and youth activism involved in your movement.
So I'll speak from the state government first. You know, we've talked a lot about the strengths Maryland has, about our history of action, our culture of action, but one of them is, of course, the university system in Maryland, having, world-class, research organization right here. The university plays a very important and formal and legal role in our climate change program here through the Center for Environmental Science. So the university is for the regulators, making sure that we're using latest science and aware of solutions as they occur. But it's also another benefit we have in Maryland that the government enjoys, is that we have lots of graduates from the university system and other universities in the state. So we have plenty of talented, motivated people who are willing and able to come and work on these issues. So I think that's in Maryland, having the university system here and UMCs and the specific universities, it helps to make everything more effective, and it sort of it provides many more opportunities for us to make action. We're working on so many really exciting things right now being enabled by the university. For example, Dr. Holtman knows we're excited to start incorporating, be the first state to start including really, really robust forest measurement in all of our climate planning, so that we really understand how much carbon sequestration is coming from Maryland's forests, because thanks to UMD and NASA and others, Maryland was the first state to have our forest canopy completely mapped by at very fine level of detail by aircraft-borne LiDAR, for example. So we're incorporating that into all of our climate change planning and analysis as we figure out how this, one small question in the climate change piece of the climate change puzzle, which is how can we take advantage of forest sequestration to help mitigate the problem and provide lots of other really important air quality and water quality and wildlife benefits. The academic institutions within the state are absolutely fundamental to the everything we're trying to accomplish here.
Thanks, Chris. I definitely echo how important academic involvement has been in this, in our advocacy at CCAN. Most recently, we had President Emeritus of the University of Maryland Center for Environmental Science, Don Bosch. He's been involved in a lot of our work. He's great, and we had him and other folks from that department testify on behalf of the bill this year, consistently giving really great information to our grassroots base. I know we featured him as well at our Rebuild Maryland conference, which happened at UMD. So we've seen consistent just showing up from a lot of great academics. And in terms of the youth activism, that has been so inspiring to see. The big shout out to the SGA Environmental Committee for helping us out at lobby days, and just again consistently showing up. We have seen one of the most incredible activist in Maryland is actually a 15-year-old Callan Benson. If you haven't ever seen her speak, she's incredible, and she did a vow of silence during the 2019 session for the Healthy Green Amendment. And it's been a real big inspiration. I mean, we're seeing high schoolers, we're seeing college students really coming out to stuff, and I got a lot of inspiration from that, for sure. And I think that that's really where the sustaining momentum from our movement is going to come from. And also just how, again, to that, like the way that that youth are communicating about this issue and really making it a moral issue is really inspiring. So I could continue to speak on this for a while, but I just want to say that there are great activists at the UMD community, at the UMBC community, and elsewhere that if you're not already connected to and you're on this call, you should get connected to.
So let me jump in here. The University of Maryland it was founded as a public institution, a land grant, sea grant university with a mission to serve the public interests and the public good, the economy of the state of Maryland, as well as the citizens of the state of Maryland, and beyond. It's not just sort of ending at the boundary. Now, initially, that vision was focused on much more kind of, like growing new kinds of apple varieties and these kinds of things, which, by the way, we're still doing and they're still very, very valuable. But our mission has expanded. It now includes these issues that we're focusing on today of how to think about a transformation of our economy that serves the people that Vaughn mentioned a couple of minutes ago, that serves our communities in different ways, that provides lots of new technologies, new kinds of jobs, and a kind of cleaner future for the people who live here, and because of spillovers for people who live potentially around the world. And those things are what sort of form the core. I'm very proud to be part of the University of Maryland. That is part of who we are. And we can look to that as we're thinking about our contributions going forward, advancing the field through research, educating. There's so many of you on the line right now are students at the University of Maryland, and you're learning, you're engaging, you're getting involved, as Emily was just saying, with thinking about how to apply the things you're learning to topics you are committed to in your heart and in your mind. And then finally, using our platform as a university with a sort of a balanced view of what the different sort of opportunities might be, what the different stakeholders could do, and providing a neutral convening platform to have conversations like this, to think about what more we can do together. And I think we can look to those functions of a university and how we use the University of Maryland system, but others also in the state of Maryland, to have those conversations, to build a broader politics for faster and more ambitious action for all.
Great. Well, I won't repeat the excellent points already made about the role of academia in higher education, but it's certainly the case that, that from a policymaking perspective, we absolutely rely on Maryland's institutions of higher learning and higher education to give us the latest and greatest science. I just like to underscore the point about the youth activists. They really, I think, more than anything, have given me much more optimism and hope in the future of the planet in the last couple of years than anyone. I think they've injected newfound energy and really radicalism into the environmental movement at a really, really crucial time. And they've young people have provided some of the best testimony at my bill hearings. But I think what's really powerful is not that they've been willing to, the youth activists have been willing to engage in politics in the traditional ways, voting and testifying in hearings, talking to legislators, but they've also been willing to engage in politics in these more unorthodox ways, through direct action, occupying people's offices, putting their bodies in the street, disrupting traffic. And I think it really takes all of these different tools in the toolbox to affect policy change, and that's been what's so inspiring. And so I think really if large numbers of millennials and Gen Zers dedicate themselves to this cause and are willing to spend their time and resources on this effort, on a continuing basis, then I think that we can make Maryland the most aggressive and progressive state in the union on these issues, and we can avert climate catastrophe. But if that doesn't happen, if there's burnout, or if this generation stops participating, then honestly we're probably screwed.
Great. Well, thank you all for answering all these questions that I had for you. We're now going to open up the floor to the audience to send in some questions for the panel. You can message them privately to the Earth Day host in the chat, but I'm going to start with a few that we've already gotten. So many have drawn parallels between the COVID-19 pandemic and the climate change crisis. So how have you seen your environmental work impacted by this, and have you seen any positives to take away? And in this part, it can only be a few of you. It doesn't have to be every single one.
Also, I'll start. Obviously, on the positives, as we've probably all read in the newspaper and seen from some of the data that lots of people are gathering. Pollution is down right now. It's not down for the reasons we would want it to. So it's we don't want to celebrate that, but it does point to there may be some things we can learn from this to more effectively reduce pollution, for example, through more teleworking. I think there are very clear parallels between the how we're seeing the COVID-19 crisis play out and how we've seen the climate change crisis play out. For example, the lack of federal leadership leading to sort of states to try to pick up that mantle, and so we see that we've seen uneven action across states on climate change for some time now. And it's clear that when we don't have the federal action we need to coordinate things, then we get uneven results. And when what we've seen in climate change is that when states like Maryland and other states try to pick up the ball and advance it, we don't have the same tools that the federal government has, and often some of the progress we make is lost through inaction in other states. So perhaps one thing we could learn from this is just reminding everyone how important it is that we have sort of evidence-based decisions at the federal level, right? That we have leadership informed by science and evidence, and perhaps this crisis can remind us all of that, so that we can sort of demand that in the climate realm as well at the federal level.
I guess I'll jump in. I mean, I think from a philosophical standpoint, both crises underscore the fact that humans can't be healthy unless the world's healthy, and both demand that people do, I think, what was previously unimaginable, whether it's shutting down society or, in this case, transforming society and kind of building a new economic system. I think the mutual aid efforts that have sprung up, like getting groceries and creating masks, show the potential for community action in the face of crisis. And I think that the official calls for people to stay home from the government reveal the importance of government action and government expertise, as Chris said, and the need for every person to buy in and participate. But I think at the core here, there are really two widely divergent paths that this could take. So first is that basically the pandemic, as I sort of alluded to, will instill kind of a greater appreciation for what government and what scientists and what regular people can do collectively to combat climate change. And that maybe that will involve, rethinking what our cities look like and trying to reorient our roads to be more about people instead of about cars, and maybe even reimagining the nature of work and promoting telework. But I think that another path that this can go down if we're not careful, and why we have to really all remain active here, is that the economic damage that's going to be caused by the coronavirus could really set climate policy back for years and maybe even decades to come. So I'm really hoping that the federal government capitalizes on this opportunity with low interest rates to use kind of a green jobs program or a Green New Deal to jumpstart the economy. Now, obviously, that seems unlikely with the current president and the current Congress, but perhaps we'll get a new president and a new Congress in January. And I really hope, and I'm going to be really pushing back on efforts in Maryland to implement essentially austerity, because I think the reality is that cutting back on dollars going to climate infrastructure now, because we don't have enough money or we're unwilling to raise taxes on people that can afford it, I think we're just going to have to end up paying a lot more money down the road if we take that tack now. And so here in Maryland, we have to make sure that we fight back against that sort of pro-austerity rhetoric.
Great, thank you. Before our next question, I just want to remind the audience that if you want to stay for the breakout session, to fill out the form at go.umd.edu/Earth Day breakouts. So another good question that we got from the audience, two merged into one, is what advice would you give to students who feel anxious about the future of our planet regarding both environmental protection and climate change? And along that same line, what do you, as an activist or person that works very much in the environmental sector, what do you do to deal with the burnout that you feel?
I would like to answer that question. I'd also I did want to add one thought to the last question, which is that one thing that's being demonstrated by the situation is how much less control we have about as to what our response can be, the more that we procrastinate on solving the crisis. So we're in a situation where we had to see a very extreme response, and there's a similar lack of options that we'll see if we don't, and you know, bringing out some really negative aspects if we don't act on this sooner rather than later. But in regards to how do I stay inspired as an activist? How do I avoid burnout? I think it really comes down to taking, there's a couple of ways to do this. I think it comes down to, you know, recruiting more people to make the work lighter. Many hands make light work, and doing things with friends and doing things with community is really important to, first of all, making sure that you don't feel alone, and that second of all, the work is more pleasant with people that you are in. If you really find a good community to do action with, like, that is so important. And second of all, allowing yourself to be in your feelings. You know, it's you shouldn't deny how you feel, and then take that and use that to propel you forward. And again, that's where that community really helps to process those emotions, to keep it, to be honest about that instead of, you know, trying to push that down, but then find ways that you know, you can take that feeling and examine it and put it to drive you even further. That's been my experience anyway. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, that was great.
So let me inject one other idea here, and very much want to build off of Emily's point, which I think was really well said. So another way to look at this is let me tie back also to Vaughn's point about the catalytic and I think almost transformational impact that the youth movement has made in the last 3, let's say, years. I mean, let's put it this way: Earth Day 1970 was the original youth movement, right? Like, so it all goes back. It all goes back to that. It's the same spirit that was in Earth Day 1970 that is animating the environmental movement today, and providing that driving energy to actually help us get over the line in some of these political discussions. And so I want to note a couple of things. First of all, while the job it remains quite challenging and can feel intimidating, we are already making some progress. And again, so let's note that progress has been made. There have been, you know, we're not there, but there have been a number of victories in the last couple of years at the local, state, city level, as I've said before, that demonstrates the potential of the strategies that are being deployed, right? And we know from the work that's been done here and elsewhere that that transformational energy can, in fact, carry further and do more. So you are already making a difference is one message. A second message is that as you're doing this, you can actually find ways that, whether it's working through organizations like Emily was saying, or maybe as Vaughn has sort of demonstrated, sort of run for office, right? Like you too can actually get out there and sort of be that change maker in some way. And I think that's a way that you can actually fight back some of the spirit of those sort of ghosts of despair that are always haunting us in this field, is to actually get out there and get your hands in it in some way that makes sense for you. And do something bold and big. And you can see Vaughn sitting there right there. He took the plunge. He's now able to kind of represent some of his constituents with his voice that you've heard so eloquently earlier. And I think that's something that you should all be considering. What is your role as you're thinking about the next couple of years?
That is an excellent segue for the last question that I have for you all. To give me just very quick, short answers about what is one thing that every young person can do right now to take action for the earth.
Well, I'm going to take this opportunity to shamelessly plug CCAN. I have a lot of actions that I'm working on. We have another organizer on staff as well, and we are constantly looking for new voices, new volunteers. And I mentioned before, we have a really big effort to really grow in the next couple of years. And we really want your voice. So you'll get a sign-in link to stay in touch with CCAN, I know, at some point after we're done. Get involved with us. We need you for lobby days. We need you for all kinds of actions, and we would love to have you.
Yeah, so I guess I'll jump in. I mean, I think that, yeah, building off that, I mean, I think probably the best, easiest thing to do is to just look up, advocacy organizations that are existing both at UMD and in Maryland statewide that you can tap into, whether it's CCAN, whether it's League of Conservation Voters, Sierra Club, or one of the more youth-oriented groups like Sunrise. Now would be a good time to reach out and see what sort of virtual programming that those organizations are having that you can tune in via Zoom during the pandemic, and that you can start going to meetings when the crisis is over. I think I also hear a lot of times from younger people that they feel like they don't have the requisite knowledge base on issues in environmentalism and climate. Maybe they're like not super into science, or it seems a little bit over their head, and so they're intimidated to join a group without having like a base level of knowledge. This could be potentially a good time to just read. Just start skimming articles about climate change and about climate activism, about the coronavirus's effect on what could be happening going forward, because it really could be a sea change moment that completely changes our expectations about what's to come. And then I guess I'll just put in a shameless plug where if you just Google like Vaughn Stewart, Maryland, and go to my state public page, you want to shoot me an email and have like a Zoom chat over coffee or something like that about like other ways that you can get involved, or, how I thought about running for office. And if you're interested in getting kind of involved on the more policy or legislative or political side, hit me up and we'll get right back to you. And I have a fair amount of time on my hands these days, and I'm happy to get like a virtual coffee with you if that would be helpful.
So this is Chris. I'll say, in addition to all those good points, those of you who are, college students, take classes on this, right, and learn about it. Get involved professionally if you can. If you have that interest, get involved outside of your professional life. The government, the executive and legislative branches are constantly, operating in a way to try to get people's input. So, come to regulatory hearings that MDE is holding, or bill hearings in the General Assembly, and give that input. And it's also, I mean, it's an even numbered year, so don't forget to vote.
Yeah, amen on that. And final short comment from me, dealing with these sustainability issues, whether it's the really huge, broad challenge of climate change or any of the others we've mentioned today, it really requires this kind of all of society approach, right? It's not, yes, run for office, vote, go to those hearings, do the individual action, but also all of you are part of organizations in some form or another. Get those whatever you're a member of, get them to do something, right? Whether it's, buying clean electricity or whatever, our organizations give us bigger leverage than what we have as individuals. And organizations can be political organizations, they can be other kinds of organizations, but somehow you're members of organizations. And think about ways that you can get those organizations to understand better what the challenges are, but also use your creative energy to help them find some solutions.
Awesome. And with that, we are closing the portion of the panel. Thank you again to our panelists for taking the time to give us such insightful answers. Now we're going to take a 10-minute break to take a stretch, go grab some water or a snack, and then we're going to go into breakout sessions if you so choose to. And Maggie, do you want to talk a bit more about that?
Sure. Well, thank you to our panelists. That was a fantastic discussion. For our event attendees, so many of you have filled out the link. Thank you so much. But we are, if I'm being honest, having a little bit of a technical difficulty in getting everyone in the rooms. So what we're going to do is I have most of you pre-assigned already, but if you're interested in attending the breakout sessions, please stay online. I'm going to make sure that everyone gets sorted in, and then around 3:07, a few minutes before 3:10, we're going to open up the breakout sessions and move everyone into them and then sort anyone that hasn't been added. So it's going to be a shuffling effort, but I think it's going to go quite well.
Thank you all so much. And for those that aren't joining us for the breakout session, thank you for joining us for the panel discussion. I hope you get to go outside for a couple of minutes responsibly, staying away from people, and enjoy all that Earth has to give us. So thank you, everyone.